Marcus Thompson, an accomplished black judge, took a deep breath as his car pulled up in front of the Cook County Courthouse, located at 50 West Washington Street in the heart of downtown Chicago. The clock on his dashboard read 8:50 a.m. He had 10 minutes before the trial began, a case that had garnered attention across the city and beyond. Today wasn't just about delivering justice. It was about addressing a system that had repeatedly failed people like him, like his family, like so many others. Stepping out of his gray sedan, Marcus adjusted his black robe and smoothed his tie. He had presided over hundreds of cases in his career, but this one felt different. The defendant, Darnell Wright, a young black man, had been arrested while waiting for a rideshare in his own neighborhood. The arresting officer claimed Darnell fit the description of someone involved in suspicious activity. To Marcus, it was a painfully familiar story, a story repeated far too often in Chicago's streets. As Marcus strode toward the courthouse, the weight of the trial pressed heavily on him. The outcome could set a precedent for addressing racial profiling in Illinois. Cameras flashed from across the street as reporters swarmed the main steps of the courthouse, their microphones ready to capture the buzz surrounding the case. Avoiding the crowd, Marcus veered toward the side entrance, his polished shoes clicking rhythmically against the pavement. Near the side door, a young white police officer stood guard, his stance rigid and his eyes sharp. As Marcus approached, he instinctively reached for his ID badge, the same way he had done countless times before. But before he could display it, the officer stepped into his path, blocking the doorway. "Sir, I need to see some identification," the officer said, his tone curt and authoritative. Marcus held up his badge, letting it dangle from the lanyard around his neck. "Judge Marcus Thompson," he stated firmly. "I'm presiding over the Wright case this morning." The officer didn't even glance at the badge. His gaze traveled over Marcus with a slow, scrutinizing look that sent a familiar chill through his spine. "There's been an incident nearby, and you match the description of someone involved," the officer said, his voice laced with suspicion. "I'm going to need you to answer a few questions." For a moment, Marcus stood frozen, disbelief washing over him. Here he was, about to oversee a landmark trial on racial profiling, only to find himself the victim of it right outside the courthouse doors. He took a measured breath, willing himself to stay calm. "Officer," he began, his tone steady despite the anger building inside. "I don't have time for this. The trial starts in less than 10 minutes and I need to get inside." He held up his badge again, urging the officer to look at it. Instead, the officer's hand hovered near his belt, close to the set of handcuffs clipped at his side. "I don't care who you say you are," the officer snapped, stepping closer. "You're coming with me." Marcus's heartbeat quickened as he saw the look in the officer's eyes, a mixture of suspicion and power. It was a look he had encountered too many times growing up on Chicago's South Side. This wasn't about him being a judge, it was about him being black. Before Marcus could respond, another voice interrupted the tense moment. "What's going on here?" The deep voice carried authority and concern. Marcus turned to see a middle-aged black officer approaching. His face shifted from confusion to shock as he recognized Marcus. "Judge Thompson?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Yes," Marcus replied, his voice tight. The older officer shot a pointed look at his younger colleague. "Stand down," he ordered firmly. The younger officer hesitated, his jaw tightening, but he eventually stepped back. "He matches the description," the young officer muttered, as though justifying himself. "That's the judge," the older officer snapped. "Do you want to lose your job?" The younger officer grumbled under his breath but backed off completely. Marcus took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. The rage simmering beneath his calm exterior threatened to bubble over, but he knew better. Losing his temper now would only validate the assumptions of men like this officer. "Are you all right, sir?" the older officer asked, his tone softer now. "I'm fine," Marcus replied curtly, though his jaw remained clenched. Without another word, he walked past the officers and into the courthouse. The familiar sterile halls offered some comfort, but the incident replayed in his mind, each moment sharper than the last. Today was supposed to be about justice, about change. But for Marcus, it was also a harsh reminder of the reality he still faced. No matter how far he had come, no matter his position or accomplishments, he would always be seen through the lens of his race. As he made his way to the courtroom, Marcus took a moment to center himself. The trial loomed ahead, but the weight of the morning's events lingered. For now, he needed to focus on the task at hand, delivering justice not just for Darnell Wright, but for everyone who had ever been treated like they didn't belong. Marcus Thompson entered courtroom 1904, a spacious, high-ceilinged chamber filled with the hum of quiet conversations and the weight of anticipation. The gallery was packed with spectators, journalists, and activists. The Wright case had drawn widespread attention not only for its specifics, but also for what it represented: the enduring issue of racial profiling in American policing. Marcus moved toward the bench, his steps steady, his expression neutral. He glanced briefly at the defense table, where Darnell Wright sat next to his attorney, a young but fierce lawyer named Erica Powell. Darnell's shoulders were tense, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. Despite the pressure in the room, he met Marcus's gaze with a glimmer of hope. Marcus nodded subtly, offering what reassurance he could. At the prosecution table sat Assistant State's Attorney Rachel Gibson, a formidable litigator known for her no-nonsense approach. She was already flipping through her notes, her demeanor as sharp as the tailored suit she wore. Marcus had seen her in action before. She didn't shy away from hard truths. The bailiff called the courtroom to order, and Marcus took his seat at the bench. "Good morning, everyone," he began, his voice calm but firm. "We are here today to address the case of Darnell Wright versus the state of Illinois. This trial will be conducted with the utmost fairness and respect. I expect nothing less from all present." As the attorneys made their opening statements, Marcus listened intently, his face unreadable. Rachel Gibson painted a picture of diligent policing, arguing that Officer Bill Jennings, Darnell's arresting officer, had reasonable suspicion to detain him. She framed the incident as a misunderstanding rather than a deliberate act of discrimination. But Erica Powell's opening statement cut through the courtroom like a blade. "This case is about more than one man's wrongful arrest," she said, her voice steady and commanding. "It's about a pattern, a deeply ingrained pattern of racial profiling that has plagued our communities for far too long. My client, Mr. Wright, was targeted not because of his actions, but because of his skin color. And today we're here to hold the system accountable." The room fell silent as her words hung in the air. Marcus felt the weight of those words deeply. They echoed not just Darnell's story but his own experiences, including the confrontation outside the courthouse just moments earlier. He shifted in his chair, keeping his focus on the proceedings. The first witness was called: Darnell Wright himself. As he took the stand, Marcus leaned forward slightly, his eyes fixed on the young man. Darnell's voice was steady, though tinged with emotion, as he recounted the events of that evening. "I was waiting for my rideshare," Darnell began, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I'd just finished my shift at the restaurant and was heading home. I wasn't doing anything suspicious, just standing there, checking my phone." "And then what happened?" Erica Powell asked. "A police car pulled up," Darnell said, his voice tightening. "The officer got out and started asking me questions, what I was doing there, where I was going. I told him I was waiting for a ride, but he didn't believe me. He kept saying I fit the description of someone they were looking for." "What happened next?" Powell prompted. Darnell hesitated, his eyes glancing briefly toward the jury. "He told me to put my hands on the hood of the car, then he searched me, put me in handcuffs, and called for backup. I was standing there in front of my neighbors, humiliated. I hadn't done anything wrong." As Darnell spoke, Marcus felt a surge of anger rise within him, not at the young man, but at the system that had led to this moment. He had heard stories like this before countless times, but hearing it directly from Darnell hit differently. It was raw, personal, and painfully familiar. The prosecution cross-examined Darnell, attempting to paint his actions as nervous and evasive, but Erica Powell's sharp objections and Darnell's consistent testimony made it clear he hadn't been doing anything wrong. The courtroom grew tense as the next witness was called: Officer Bill Jennings. The same officer who had arrested Darnell now took the stand. Jennings, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 30s, walked to the witness stand with a stiff gait. His uniform was immaculate, but his demeanor betrayed discomfort. Rachel Gibson began her questioning, guiding Jennings to explain his actions that night. "Officer Jennings, can you tell the court why you approached Mr. Wright?" Jennings nodded, clearing his throat. "We had a report of a suspicious individual in the area. Mr. Wright matched the description. Young male, dark clothing, standing near the corner." "And what specifically caught your attention about Mr. Wright?" Gibson asked. Jennings hesitated. He seemed nervous, kept looking around like he was trying to avoid being seen. Erica Powell's cross-examination, however, unraveled Jennings's narrative. "Officer Jennings," she began, her tone sharp, "you stated that my client matched the description. Can you clarify what that description was?" Jennings shifted uncomfortably. Young black male, dark hoodie." Powell raised an eyebrow. "And how many young black men in dark hoodies might you see in that neighborhood on any given evening?" Jennings didn't respond immediately, his silence speaking volumes. As Powell pressed further, Jennings's story began to show cracks. It became evident that his assumptions, rather than any concrete evidence, had driven his actions. Marcus watched the jury closely, noting the growing unease among some of the jurors. They could see the pattern Powell had described in her opening statement. By the time court adjourned for the day, the tension in the room was palpable. Marcus remained seated at the bench, his mind racing. He had witnessed firsthand the subtle but insidious nature of bias in Jennings's testimony. It wasn't just about Darnell Wright. It was about every person who had ever been judged, detained, or humiliated simply for existing in the wrong place. As the courtroom emptied, Marcus took a deep breath, preparing himself for the battles yet to come. This was only the beginning. The courtroom was packed again the next morning. Marcus Thompson sat at the bench, his face calm, but his thoughts turbulent. Yesterday's testimonies had painted a damning picture of the events leading to Darnell Wright's arrest. But today's session promised even more intensity as the prosecution and defense prepared to dig deeper into the systemic issues underpinning the case. The first witness of the day was an expert in racial profiling, Dr. Cynthia Hayes, a sociologist who had spent decades studying implicit bias in law enforcement. Erica Powell called her to the stand, and Marcus watched as the jury leaned forward, clearly intrigued by what she had to say. "Dr. Hayes," Powell began, "can you explain to the court what implicit bias is and how it manifests in policing?" Dr. Hayes adjusted her glasses and nodded. "Implicit bias refers to the unconscious attitudes or stereotypes that influence our perceptions and decisions. In policing, it can lead officers to view individuals of certain racial or ethnic backgrounds as inherently more suspicious or threatening, even when there's no evidence to support that perception." Powell followed up quickly. "And in your research, have you found evidence of implicit bias affecting policing practices in cities like Chicago?" "Absolutely, Doctor," Hayes replied without hesitation. "Studies consistently show that Black and Latino individuals are disproportionately stopped, searched, and arrested compared to their white counterparts, even when controlling for factors like crime rates in specific neighborhoods. This pattern reflects not individual malice, but a systemic issue embedded in law enforcement culture." The courtroom was silent as her words sank in. Marcus could feel the weight of the testimony pressing down on everyone present. He glanced at the jury, noting the varied reactions, some nodding in agreement, others clearly uncomfortable. Rachel Gibson rose for cross-examination, attempting to poke holes in Dr. Hayes' testimony. "Dr. Hayes, would you agree that officers often have to make split-second decisions in high-pressure situations?" "Yes," Dr. Hayes conceded. "But implicit bias can influence those decisions, often without the officer even realizing it. That's why it's so dangerous. It operates in the background, unchecked." Gibson pressed on, but Dr. Hayes remained composed, her responses steady and backed by data. By the end of her testimony, it was clear that the jury had been given a lot to consider. Next, Erica Powell called a surprise witness, Sergeant Frank Williams, a veteran officer in the same precinct as Bill Jennings. Williams, a black man in his late 40s, had initially been reluctant to testify, but Powell had convinced him that his voice could make a difference. "Sergeant Williams," Powell began, "can you describe your experience working in the same precinct as Officer Jennings?" Williams hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I've been with the department for over 20 years, he said, his voice measured. "I've seen a lot of good officers, people who genuinely care about protecting the community. But I've also seen officers who bring their biases to work with them, whether they admit it or not." "Can you elaborate?" Powell asked. Williams took a deep breath. "There's an unspoken culture in some parts of the department, a mindset that certain neighborhoods, certain people, are more likely to cause trouble. It's not written down anywhere, but it's there. And it influences how officers approach their work." Powell nodded. "And in your opinion, does this culture contribute to cases like Mr. Wright's?" "Yes," Williams said firmly. "It does." Rachel Gibson's cross-examination was aggressive, but Williams held his ground. He acknowledged the challenges of police work but refused to excuse the systemic biases that had led to Darnell Wright's arrest. Finally, the prosecution called their own witness, Officer Bill Jennings. Marcus sat up straighter in his chair as Jennings made his way to the stand. The officer looked noticeably more tense than he had during his initial testimony, his face pale and his movements stiff. Rachel Gibson began her questioning, guiding Jennings through his version of events. He repeated the same points he had made the day before: the report of a suspicious individual, the matching description, the nervous behavior. But under Powell's cross-examination, Jennings began to falter. "Officer Jennings," Powell began, her voice calm but firm, "yesterday you testified that Mr. Wright was acting nervous and out of place. Can you explain what you meant by out of place?" Jennings hesitated, his eyes darting toward Gibson for reassurance. He didn't seem like he belonged in that area," he said finally. "And why didn't he belong?" Powell pressed, her tone sharp. "Because he was black?" "No," Jennings protested, though his voice lacked conviction. "It wasn't about that." "Wasn't it?" Powell shot back. "You saw a young black man standing on a corner, wearing a hoodie, and you assumed he was up to something. You didn't ask questions. You didn't consider any other possibilities. You just acted on your assumptions. Isn't that true?" Jennings didn't respond immediately. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. As Powell continued to dismantle Jennings's testimony, Marcus watched the jury's reactions closely. Some jurors looked visibly uncomfortable, while others seemed angry, not at Powell, but at what her questioning revealed about Jennings and the system he represented. By the time Jennings stepped down from the stand, he looked like a man defeated. Powell had exposed not just his individual failings, but the broader issues within the department. Marcus called for a recess, giving everyone a chance to catch their breath. As the courtroom emptied, he remained seated at the bench, his mind racing. Today's testimonies had laid bare the systemic issues at the heart of the case. But the hardest part was yet to come, guiding the jury toward a verdict that would not only deliver justice for Darnell Wright, but also send a message about the need for change. When the court reconvened, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Marcus Thompson took his seat at the bench, his gaze steady as the jury filed back into their seats. The day's proceedings had been emotionally charged, and the weight of what lay ahead was palpable. The jury would soon deliberate, and their decision would carry implications far beyond the walls of this courtroom. Rachel Gibson rose for her closing arguments. She strode toward the jury, her tone measured but forceful. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "this case is not about systemic issues or racial tensions. It's about one officer making a split-second decision based on the information he had at the time. Officer Jennings acted in good faith, responding to a report of suspicious activity. While the outcome may not have been ideal, we must remember that policing is a difficult job, one where mistakes can happen without malicious intent." Her argument was clear. This wasn't about bias, but about human error. She appealed to the jury's sense of fairness, urging them to consider the challenges of law enforcement, Then it was Erica Powell's turn. She approached the jury with a calm, yet unyielding intensity. "This case is about far more than a single mistake," she began. "It's about a pattern that's been allowed to persist for far too long." Officer Jennings didn't just make a mistake. He acted on assumptions rooted in bias, whether he realized it or not. Darnell Wright wasn't out of place. He was in his own neighborhood, waiting for a ride. Yet, in Officer Jennings' eyes, that was enough to make him suspicious. Powell's voice rose slightly, her conviction filling the room. "This isn't just about Darnell Wright. It's about every person who's been judged, detained, or humiliated simply because of how they look. You have the power to send a message that this kind of profiling is unacceptable, that it has no place in our justice system. Use that power wisely."